on this episode of the WildFed podcast.
It's highly manipulated land. And so consequently, when humankind has manipulated the landscape so much, the obligation of management is also there.
These aren't natural deer herds. We've created this tremendous boom in their populations. I think a lot of people imagine there'd be more deer if it wasn't for people.
20 years ago, Cwd was discovered about 65 miles to the south of us. And you realize that you probably won't eradicate it, like dandelions on a lawn. And then the question becomes, is the cure worse than the disease?
When you've grown up on a farm or you're around hunting, it's very easy to think about the species and not get too hung up on the individual, but it seems like a lot of times you get very hung up on the individual at the expense of the herd.
Get involved, bring these concerns up, be supportive of your agencies, talk to other hunters, and fill your tags. We are not going to run out of deer.
Episode number 78 of the WildFed podcast. It's not ours, it's just our turn. With Doug Duren is brought to you by Surthrival. Every year I harvest and make my own medicine with my two favorite medicinal mushrooms, chaga and reishi. Both are historically celebrated in folk medicine for their many health benefits, and today both have been heavily researched and validated by modern science and shown to be strongly antioxidant, adaptogenic, anti-mutagenic, and immune modulating. This means they optimize your immune system, help you adapt to the stresses of modern living, fight cancer, and quell the free radical cascade caused by industrial pollution and just the oxidative stress of modern living. Surthrival produces both chaga and reishi mushroom extracts to the same exacting standards I make them for myself. That means Surthrival works with only wild or organic wood-grown mushroom fruit bodies, not that low-end grain-grown mycelial biomass that are used for so many supplements. And that means dual extracting, both in hot water and alcohol, to ensure you get both fractions of the mushroom. Never buy a mushroom supplement without first ensuring they do this. And it means bottling in the highest grade, light protective, violet Miron glass. Right now at surthrival.com, if you buy one bottle of either reishi or chaga, you get your second bottle for half off. Head over to surthrival.com to get yours today and check out the rest of the incredible product line. Today's episode is also brought to you by the Hunter's Journey online mentorship program. Whether you're exploring becoming a new hunter, you're ready to take the leap and start a hunting journey of your own, or you're a beginner hunter working towards your first harvests, hunting can be daunting. Where do you start? What gear and knowledge do you need? What do you do when your strategy's not working? And most importantly, how do you hunt ethically and sustainably? An ancient and essential part of the hunter's journey is having a mentor. You may remember Chris Gilmore from episode 58 on tracking and awareness. Well, he's created a comprehensive, one-of-a-kind online hunting mentorship program called The Hunter's Journey. If you want to feel the empowerment of harvesting your own food from the land and you believe in doing it with ethics and sustainability as your guiding principles, you're going to want to check out thehuntersjourney.com. And as a special offer for all WildFed listeners, the coupon code WildFed100 gets you $100 off. Head over to thehuntersjourney.com. Again, that's thehuntersjourney.com, and use the coupon code WildFed100 to get $100 off. I'm Daniel Vitalis, and you're listening to the WildFed podcast, a show about reconnecting with nature through hunting, fishing, foraging, and food. WildFed. Food is all around you. Doug Duren is a thoughtful, articulate conservationist, landowner, hunter, farmer, and frequent guest on the Meat Eater TV show and podcast, and a repeat guest on the Joe Rogan Experience. With all the beauty and eloquence of a haiku, his guiding principle is simple. It's not ours, it's just our turn. As someone who owns a bit of land in Maine, I couldn't agree more. Doug's quickly becoming a national voice in the conservation movement and in particular in the conversation around chronic wasting disease in the North American deer herd. In fact, he's on the front lines, helping to develop local programs to mitigate the CWD risk for both people and the landscape, as well as altering his deer management strategy to employ the newly emerging best practices to deal with this unfortunate disease. We cover a lot of ground in this interview, from the impacts of big ag on the wild game we harvest, to getting new hunters access to good hunting grounds, how chronic wasting disease is changing the hunting space and what we can do about it, and ultimately, what it really means to be stewards of the landscapes we care for during our short visit here on Earth. Because, like Doug says, the planet and its ecology isn't ours, but it is our turn to be good stewards. Doug Duren, welcome to the show.
Hey, very nice to meet you, Daniel.
It's nice to connect with you, man. I think a lot of our listeners are very familiar with you because they've seen you or heard you on Meat Eater's show or podcast, and that's where I became familiar with you. And I wanted to start off by just saying thank you for everything you've done, because there's all this talk, hunter numbers are down and, blah, blah, blah about conservation. But I'm personally witnessing what feels like a kind of a populist uprising in the world of hunting, this revolution in hunting. And you have hosted Ranella, you've hosted Joe Rogan, so many of the people from the Meat Eater crowd at your place. And in many ways, I think you've been really instrumental in what's happening in the country right now. So I just wanted to say thank you for all that.
Well, that's really nice of you to say. Getting to know Steve and being a part of all that's been really, has been a real special experience for me. But the hosting of people on the farm isn't just famous people. There was an old joke in Casanova about, hey, I wish I was famous. I could hunt on the Duren farm. And there are a lot of people around here who will tell you that, well, I've hunted out there too. I take kind of great pride in that, that we don't get me wrong. It's very controlled. And I think that's an important thing as a landowner, to control your property. Our land had been wide open back when I was a kid, which was a long time ago. And there were some incidents and that sort of thing. So one of my takeaways from all of that is, how can we have people on our property and yet still have control of it? And this is how we're doing it. It's by invitation, and I've had people reach out to me. And there's some other things that I'm working on as well. The one vein through all of the folks I invite is that they have somehow made a contribution to conservation. And in some cases, those are folks doing work on our farm. Yeah. In other cases, one of my regular hunters now is a young man who's on our Conservation Congress who lost his hunting spot. And I said, if you can't come up with another one, come on, you can come over and hunt with me. And I guess it's worth explaining, because I kind of know about where you are in Maine, because I lived out there for a while. But in my area, Southwest Wisconsin, 95% of our hunting land is privately owned. Okay. So private landowners really kind of hold the key to hunting. And it's a lot of small parcels. I mean, stuff as small as 10 and 20 acres up to, like, our farm is 400 acres. And that, it seems like the whole world to a lot of people. And of course, the further west you go, the smaller that piece of property seems.
Sure. Yeah, as you're alluding to here in Maine, if it's not posted, it's assumed we can go onto it and hunt, which is a pretty unique opportunity out here. But as you head west and head south, it immediately closes up, and trespassing laws become a really serious thing. And so out there, you're saying permissions, having a place to hunt, having access is really what it's all about.
Yeah, it really is. And that's interesting that you say that, because here, the trespassing law used to be that you had to have it posted every X amount of feet and all of that. Yeah. And there were people had habits of taking those signs down who, as they went into a property. So okay. The law got changed. You know how it is. All it takes is, a handful of jackasses to ruin it for everybody. But the law got changed. And so now if you don't have explicit permission to be on a property, you're trespassing.
Okay. Yeah.
So it's a different, it's a different thing. And as a landowner, I like it. I very rarely grant permission to someone who just knocks on the door, right, or who stops by. As you can imagine, I get a lot of requests for access, and I tell people that it's sort of like Green Bay Packer tickets. I don't know if you're familiar with Green Bay Packers, but it's really hard to get a Green Bay Packer ticket, right? Okay. And you get on a list, and so I have a list of people who've, asked for permission, but generally I try to keep it, semi-local. I have people from various points in the country, as we were just talking about our friend Jenna Roselle, who's going to be a part of a group here. But as a landowner, one of the things you ask is, well, what's in it for me?
That's what I
And
was
you
going to
know,
ask
Jen,
you. I was going to say,
yeah,
because having all these people come out, for sure, some amount of harvest is good for your land, but ultimately, people come out, they walk away with something. What is in it for you?
well, when it comes to deer hunting, for instance, we have a pretty long season. And as maybe we will talk about, we also have a little bit of a population and disease problem here. And so in some of that, I am trying to control population and therefore disease. So that in the, in the bigger conservation sense, that's one of the things that I get out of it. Um, I do expect people to make some sort of contribution to conservation. So conservation gets something out of it. Most of the people who hunt with me are making a contribution on the farm. So they're helping me with timber stand improvement work or invasive species control, or a couple of the guys are carpenters and they're helping me with carpentry work and, and those sort of things. And so there's sort of a cooperative model,
Mm-hmm.
if you will, that we're kind of in this together. Um, and if you, I'm guessing you know about Elda Leopold. I know you do because you and Carl were talking about Elda Leopold. But Leopold had a project that he was involved with that was called the Riley Game Cooperative. And it was a group of people working with landowners in a cooperative sense, in that those landowners were allowing those folks permission, and the people who were doing permission to hunt, and the people who were given that permission, Leopold being one of them, were doing conservation work on that land. One thing I can tell you about landowners in the Midwest is there's always something to do on a piece of land.
I bet. Yeah.
Um,
Especially
and
400
so
acres.
yeah, well, and help with that is important, right? And so, and that's one of the things. And a few years ago, I had, during turkey season, I had several groups of two come to the land, and because we have a 6-season structure, and I just asked them all to do a day's worth of work, and they had access to the land the rest of the time. Well, that work they did with me. So we were, and we weren't running chainsaws or anything like that. It was all
Mm-hmm.
quiet work,
Yeah.
limbing trees and that kind of thing. So I could kind of, or doing some carpentry work, or they were helping me pick up stuff and just pick up around the farm. But I was able to have a conversation with them about conservation, and about what we're doing on the farm. And I could tell them about some of the challenges and that. So my intent was to help grow more of a conservation ethic, or as Leopold
Mm-hmm.
called it, a land ethic. And as a landowner, it's a lot easier to feel comfortable with somebody on your land when you've gotten to know them a little
Yeah.
bit.
Mm-hmm.
So, that's a part of it. I mean, my expectations are that people will do things. Now I've got a bunch of old buddies around here that, who generally don't ask for themselves to hunt. But they'll ask for their kids to hunt. And
Yeah.
especially like when we have these antlerless only seasons, somebody will just pull up to me on the road and say, "Hey, is there any chance the kids could come out this weekend?" And I have some enclosed blinds. And so, yeah, I'll just make sure that I get them out to those different
Mm-hmm.
spots, and I don't want you wandering around, stay in the blinds. The deer come out
Yeah.
eventually. Um, and, um, and so, yeah, I get some of that control that way. And the folks around here, I grew up around this area, and they'd give you the shirt off your back if they thought you
Yeah.
needed it,
Yeah.
or you asked for it. So yeah, I tried to develop that relationship.
Tell us a little bit about where you are geographically. Maybe starting sort of at your farm and then zooming out a little bit to the greater geography, so we get a sense of
Okay.
place.
I'm in the driftless area of Southwest Wisconsin, and the driftless area is was unglaciated, um, and it's a kind of a big circle of land mass, of topography, that includes Southwest Wisconsin, Southeast Minnesota, Northeast Iowa, and Northwest Illinois.
Mm-hmm.
Um, we are My part of the driftless is pretty much on a diagonal from Madison, Wisconsin to La Crosse, Wisconsin, which is on the Mississippi River. And we're like halfway in between. If anybody has ever been to Leopold Shack, where Eldo wrote the Sand County Almanac. That's about 30 miles to the east of us.
No way.
And Frank Lloyd Wright's Taliesin, where he grew up, is about 30 miles to the west of us.
Okay.
So, and so the topography is unglaciated. Having spent time again, as I did in New England, it's a little bit more like southern Vermont and then the farm country of New York. So,
okay.
The topography is all formed by erosion. I like to say hashtag erosion, not eruption, as mountains are erupted.
Yeah.
So this was a sea bottom at one time. The geographic, the rest of the features are a lot of sandstone outcroppings. We have trout streams, rivers, that kind of stuff. Example of like Vermont again is our farm's 400 acres. We only farmed 100 acres of it.
Okay.
The rest of it's woods and some pasture. But you drill hard on those steep side hills, but not big peaks. So, and that's fairly typical. A lot of small patchy farmland. Used to be, dairy farm country, small dairy farms, 40, 50 cow dairy farms. And that's not the case anymore. But
what are you guys raising there?
I raise grass-fed beef, Hereford Angus cross. All of our cropland is in the Conservation Reserve Program, which is a federal program. It's a farmland set-aside program. But I have 60 acres of pasture, and the number of cattle I have 15 bred cows, and we're about to start calving. And a few head of steers, and I get hay from the neighbors in the neighborhood. And there's as a part of CRP, you can get hay from those fields and stuff. But it's grass-fed beef, and it's kind of interesting because in this area, what's happened to agriculture in this area, where it used to be sort of these self-sustaining farms, now there's a lot of row cropping, corn and beans, corn and beans, corn and beans.
Right.
And that's all just commodity. They're raising it for commodities. And of course that stuff is all GMO, or mostly GMO. We have a few organic farmers in the area. And so, Steve Ranella and I were talking about this one day, and I said, because people kept saying free range organic meat when they were referring to venison. I'm like, well, in our area,
let's be real here, guys. The dirty secret.
The deer can eat whatever they want, and they certainly eat corn and beans. Whereas my grass-fed beef, even though it's not certified organic, I completely control what they get.
Yeah.
Within a pasture, so my beef is actually more organic than. This is
what you're bringing up, something that doesn't get talked about very much, understandably, that we all would like to downplay it probably, but I mean, how true that is true is that of waterfowl too, where they're migrating and they're landing in all kinds of crops. And I did some hunting down in North Carolina, and Maine's a tough place to deer hunt, and I'm not a real experienced deer hunter anyway. And so, we can get one deer a year. So I go down to North Carolina where I can go down and bring home 6 of them, and I remember my buddy saying, hey, just, there's a lot of Roundup getting sprayed down here, and we have one of the highest cancer rates in the country. And I'm just thinking, oh man, that's where all those deer are. They're coming out into those fields. So,
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think it's a fair conversation to have, and I guess if I have any, qualities, I will speak the unvarnished truth as I know it, and I'm willing to listen, and I'm also willing to change my mind if somebody can talk me into something different.
Pretty rare trait these days.
Well, I mean, at least I try to. I'm dug in on a few things, but that is a really important point that we're. You can't deny, I mean, you're asking again about what the area is like. Well, you can't deny that the influence of humankind is a big part of our wildlife and our ecosystem here. That's why we have the deer population that we have. We have a huge deer population, and it's because they've got all the groceries in the world. It's amazing. So those are things that we have to think about. I mean, I've hunted in Alaska one time up in the alpine tundra, and I killed a caribou up there on meat eater, as a matter of fact.
Doug,
That's
I
the
saw
only.
you do it. I've seen
Well,
you do it.
it's amazing. Well, that's a whole different conversation. But that whole relationship with those guys and the opportunities that I've had, it's like it's really cool to have. When you remember hunts,
Mhm.
and you have like a rack, or you have a picture, or you have what I got, TV series of
Yeah,
it,
right,
and so
right.
it's really
That is cool.
it is pretty neat. But um, hunting there was very different than hunting anywhere, I think, in the lower 48, right? I mean, even if you go into the bigger wildernesses, you're still going to be dealing with animals that are much more influenced by humankind.
Yeah.
Up there, man, those caribou looked at us like, "What do you got?
Don't
What do
know what
you?"
you are, right?
Yeah,
Hmm.
it was a tremendous experience.
Right. Almost like going back in time too, where there's a migration and things like that you don't
Yeah,
have here
yeah.
anymore. Another thing that brings up for me too, when I think about something like industrial ag chemicals, they bioaccumulate. So the older you get and the more you eat things that have them in it, the more of that bioaccumulates in your body. Particularly, it's like lipid soluble, so it's in your body fat. So
Hmm.
as the years go on, you accumulate more and more. So I would ask, like, when one of your beef cattle goes to slaughter, how old is it?
The steers tend to be, because they're grass fed, and it takes them a while longer to get to that. There's no injections, no hormone. I mean, nothing, right? I actually have 6 that are about to go, and I will be selling grass fed beef, folks. Um, but I have 6 that are going in
Available at
June. Now, believe me,
DougDuren.com.
yeah, I generally don't have any trouble selling them, and it's a direct market thing. But so a grass fed steer takes 2 years
Okay,
to
so
get to that point.
you go to slaughter at 2 years, so you've got 2 years to bioaccumulate. Now, if somebody especially prior to CWD, what's the age class of a very desirable white-tailed deer?
Well, big giant buck, you mean?
Yeah,
If that's what we're
yeah,
talking
that's what
about.
we're talking about.
So yeah, a 5-year-old in this area.
Okay, so you got 5 years to bioaccumulate toxins, and
Hmm.
you're eating off of the ag field. I mean, I am a proponent of wild foods. I am in no way trying to make an argument against it. Venison, of course, that's my thing. But I
Yeah.
mean, it is something that stands out to me, is that in the world of farming, you're eating these young animals. So not only do you control their feed, but they don't have as much time to accumulate toxins. And then sometimes I mean, you have this with fish all the time, where you harvest a fish and then you find out
Oh yeah.
it's 40 years old or 60 years old or something. And so that animal's had a long time to accumulate PCBs and all the other kind of things, that pervasive chemicals that are in our environment. And anyway, I don't think we need to go too far down that road, but it is an interesting conversation that I don't hear. We're so busy defending hunting most of the time that it's like, to have these kind of conversations, they don't usually come up.
Yeah. It's interesting you say that. I would say one more thing about butchering, because, cow gets old, right? I mean, if you have brood cows like I do, they get old. I've got some cows that are 15 years old. And some of my,
15? You have 15-year-old cows?
oh yeah. Yeah.
Wow. No kidding.
Yeah. And I probably shouldn't have kept them that long,
Okay.
because they get to be these
How
big
long can they
giant
live?
cows. They're getting to the end of their life.
Yeah.
I mean, they'll live to be older than that. When I was a kid and we had dairy cattle, we had dairy cattle that would be that old.
Wow.
But so a little bit of a different thing. But now the average lifespan of a dairy animal in those bigger farms is like 5, 4.
Okay.
They
Yeah.
just don't get very old. And it's just the old way of doing things as opposed to the new way. And I guess the best way might be somewhere in between. And everything has its balance, or where's the sweet spot with all of that. I'm not sure that I could provide or that we could provide enough beef for people who want to eat it in the way that I do it. I have cattle out on 60 acres of pasture, and then I feed them hay during the winter, and our pastures are starting to come back right now, and they'll get out there. But, I'm not necessarily trying to feed the world, but I can feed an awful lot of folks on
Yeah.
6 steers a year.
Wow.
And that's kind of the average. And then I'm balancing these other things like water quality, and we're not over pasturing, and I don't have them on a feed lot. I do have getting a little murky out there right now because of I feed them in same spots during the winter, and then I pile the manure and compost it and put it back on the ground, and all of that. So, there's sort of positives and negatives in all of it. And we try to find, at least I try to find that balance. And I think that people who are thinking about all of that's true. And that's why I don't know if I said this while we were talking or before we started, but I do reserve that right to change my mind about something. And, but it's pretty much everything I do is conservation based, on our property.
One of the things I've been wanting to ask you in regard to that, I get the impression that that's been something. Again, I mean, I've seen you and heard you a bunch of times, through other media. So I have sort of this vague sense of you, but I've been wanting to ask. I've had this sense that conservation's been very important to you for a long time, but that also you've had your voice elevated to the national level recently through programs like Meat Eater. Suddenly you're part of this national conversation. And being in my industry and over the course of my career, I've met a lot of the kind of people that want to be influencers, as the rise of social media and the ability to make your own media. I know the personality type of the person who's like, I'm going to go out and become an influencer. And I don't get that vibe from you. I get, you described yourself to me before we started as a farm boy, And so, but here you are, like, kind of thrust into it. And now your voice resonates through the conservation movement in a way. So how has that been, that transition for you? And how does it feel? What are you doing with it? How to use in that platform? And just overall, how's it felt for you to go from sort of, I'm sure you were a fixture of your community, but now you're a voice in the national community?
Wow. Really interesting question to me. Really interesting question. Thank you for asking that. Well, I mean, I got to be friends with Steve Ranella because I dug his books, I heard his books and, or heard him. I heard him on Wisconsin Public Radio like 14 years ago, and ended up buying his books, the first two books, and read them very quickly and sent an email to American Buffalo, which was the website, and he gets back in touch with me, and then we became pen pals for email pen pals, but you know what I mean, for like a year. And at the end of it, I said, and that exchange was about everything from traveling to conservation to all this stuff. And he was living in New York at the time. And his own description was, well, I just fly over the Midwest now, man, unless I'm going to go and visit my mother in Michigan. And I said, well, maybe you ought to come back and try deer hunting again sometime.
Okay. Cause he's from the Midwest himself, right?
Yeah, he's from Michigan. Right. And I said, so if you'd like to come back and go deer hunting with me. And his response was 2 words, really? When? And, he came in a horrible time, horrible hunting time. It was frozen and cold, and it was really miserable. But he and I spent some time driving around, and I, told him about Leopold. I told him about Frank Lloyd Wright. I told him about the Wisconsin River. I told him about the driftless area and all that stuff. And he goes, "Well, that's really interesting. So it seems like you're really concerned about." Kind of asked the same question all those years ago. 12 or 13 years ago now, and I said, well, I don't know. I just kind of grew up with it. And so that's been a very cool thing. I mean, I have this mantra, this motto, it's not ours, it's just our turn. And that's really a nod to the past, look at the present, and then thinking about the future. And that's really
it's also true. I mean, it's also like factually, biologically accurate in a world of so much noise. That's not like just a euphemism. It's actually true. Even if you're like a megalomaniac narcissist who thinks it's not, it's like, sorry, it is true.
Yeah, you're gonna find that
give
out,
your atoms
man.
back eventually, bro.
Yeah, well, and for me, that happened. I mean, that sort of epiphany happened, I don't know, 10, 12, 13 years ago when I was up in our woods, and I'm talking about cutting my great grandfather's trees, the trees that he had managed. And we did that. And I mentioned to the forester that I was working with that, this is kind of a heavy responsibility. And he said, well, I really appreciate that you're doing that and that you're thinking about it. And I said, well, I guess I was thinking about my great-grandparents, my grandparents, and my parents. And I said, I guess I look at it as not mine or ours. It's just our turn. And he goes, you got to write that down, man.
Yeah.
and so I did.
.com.
Yeah, well, it's hashtag for sure. And yeah, and I mean, and it is my mantra and my motto, and that's expanded to a bigger sense. And so when you ask the question about, well, what's that like to go from someone who's thinking in those way, in that way, from, and being, people, I know folks around here, and I'm involved with conservation stuff around here, and everything from a little program called the Woodland Advocate Program that was with the American Forest Foundation and the Aldo Leopold Foundation, to just, people just ask me questions. And as I told you earlier, I had done work in the White Mountains out there by you, and I hand planted pine trees back when I was a young hippie dude, and traveled around, did that kind of stuff. So it all kind of led up to this opportunity. And it's been, well, here's a great example. I'm planting flowers down in Madison 4 or 5 years ago. And, this is after all the meat eater stuff had happened. And I'm like, this is part of a business that I have. And I'm planting flowers. I'm hands and knees planting flowers. And a guy walks up to me, he goes, Doug Duren? And I look up and I'm like, yeah, because I'm working,
Right.
And he goes, like, from meat eater, Doug Duren? I'm like, yeah, is something I can help you with? Because I'm working, And he goes, I just want to say I'm a big fan. I'm on my hands and knees
in the soil,
covered in soil. And it's like, I guess I'm just kind of surprised. I thought that, like, you did meat eater stuff all the time.
You're not in your palace right now wearing silk robes.
Right. Yeah. Or flying helicopters in to hunt someplace.
That's it, right? Whatever, being dropped out of a helicopter.
Hanging out with famous people all the time. And so, I guess anytime I get a little full of myself, I can always go out and shovel manure in the barn, right?
Yeah.
To kind of keep it
wood,
real.
Carry water. Yeah.
Yeah. And so there's been that, but I have to say it's very gratifying that I've had this opportunity with Meat Eater. And, I've been on Joe Rogan's podcast 3 times. And, and one time we talked about the episodes that we shot. And the second time we talked about my cattle and small farming. Yeah. And Joe just wanted to see me, so I take a buddy of mine and we fly out there and do this and have this blast in LA on Grammy night, by the way. And then the third time Joe was in Chicago in UFC, and afterwards he's like, let's go to dinner, man. And so, and my daughter's along, and he said hi to my daughter and said to me, good to see you, brother. When are we going to do a podcast about CWD? And I said, and the next thing you know, we're like comparing dates. And I said, well, here's the thing. I don't want to come on there like some jackass guitar player and talk about CWD like I'm an expert. I will come and talk about my experience and my understanding of the disease, but I would like to bring an expert with me. And by the way, I know a few. And he goes, great. Who would you bring? And I said, well, I would bring Brian Richards from the USGS Wildlife Health Center, world-renowned scientist. Steve had him on the podcast, and we recorded at the farm. But, and so that opportunity was amazing. So Brian and I fly out there. This is one of the most gratifying things. I mean, millions of people, literally millions of people have listened to or watched that podcast. Brian said to me 2 weeks later, and he's my age. He said, I've been working in science and wildlife health my entire career. 2.5 hours on a podcast. Wow. I have had a bigger impact than anything. And rather than calling me up and saying, he wasn't bemoaning it at all. Right. He called me up to thank me for that.
Yeah.
And then he thanked Joe for it. And I mean, and so that's one of the things, right? Is that I'm, when you ask the impact of it, that realizing that you have that, and I don't make a living at this. I sell some merchandise. I do a little this. I mean, I get paid for some stuff, but this is not how I make my living. It's more important to me to try to be thoughtful and try to be correct. And then also to be open, but then also to facilitate conversation about conservation. Yeah. I was just out at our local taxidermist place before I got on, man. And we were talking there for, I was like, I got to go. I'm going to be on a podcast. But we were having a great conversation about his business, how, chronic wasting disease may or may not affect it, or how it has affected, and it hasn't as of now, other than the way he handles things. But he's still got plenty of big, giant bucks. I just posted some stuff on Instagram about it. But, his concerns and that sort of thing. And those kinds of conversations are really important to me. And yeah, I like last Sunday, I hosted a Learn to Hunt event on the farm with Pheasants Forever and backcountry hunters and anglers. And we didn't go hunting. We went out walking and talking about scouting, what it's like to turkey hunt and where they hang out, looking for turkey sign. And then we were also shed hunting. But the group that was with me, they got a whole primer on conservation and, different stuff that's going on in the woods. And, I'm pointing stuff out left and right, and because it's just sort of second nature to me. So, doing that on a very small scale, but then having that opportunity to be on something like Rogan's podcast on a large scale. So it's been, it's kind of a mind bender,
Yeah, both are so important too, because the in-person thing has so much impact, and then you can also influence the conversation at a bigger level too, which is important. I do want to ask you about the CWD situation. I've had some folks on to talk about it. They always represent departments, and so there's that hesitancy to make certain kind of comments, like they are a little bit hamstrung by their job and career and what they can and can't say and how comfortable they are. And so I'd love to get sort of your more unadulterated perspectives on the whole thing. I think people listening have a sense of what it is. But I would love your thoughts on how we got here. And I guess one of the biggest questions I have for you, Doug, is do you think the way we've managed deer has had a hand in this? Is this like lightning strike, or is this like, oops, we set a trap for ourselves, didn't realize it, and in our greed, we created the conditions for this? We'll get right back to the show in a moment, but first, have you ever thought about your light diet? We think about the food we eat and the water we drink, but what about the light we consume each day and especially at night? It's important because our light diet, or the light we consume through our eyes, is like a kind of electromagnetic nutrition, and it influences our circadian rhythm and hormone production. Our bodies need that crisp blue light of the early day to set our internal clock. That's why it's so good to head outside first thing in the morning to jumpstart your day. But our computers, tablets, phones, home lighting, and vehicle headlight LEDs also use blue light that tricks our body into thinking that night is day, upsetting our melatonin production, disrupting our sleep cycle, and even impacting our all-important mitochondrial function. That's where Raw Optics come in. Raw Optics produces the finest blue light blocking glasses to filter out the unhealthy, or rather untimely, light from your devices, helping to optimize your light diet and restoring your circadian rhythm. They use melanin pigment-infused lenses with German steel and Italian acetate frames. They're streamlined and stylish, and they have daytime and nighttime designs. If you work on a computer, spend a lot of time on your phone, or drive at night where bright blue LED headlights are shining into your eyes, you need to check out Raw Optics. Go to rawoptics.com/wildfed. That's raoptics.com/wildfed for 15% off your order. Again, it's spelled RA Optics, and you'll get 15% off by going to raoptics.com/wildfed. Now, back to the show.
Not a lightning strike. Not a lightning strike. And it's a really good way of putting it. That I don't know about the greed end of it, but certainly that plays into it. Greed sounds kind of harsh, but it's probably more true than I'm giving it credit for.
I didn't choose the word haphazardly. I have a reason,
Yeah, well, you know what? I'm going to go with it, man, because it has had a part of it. It has done it. So has had a part of it. So, I won't go into the nuts and bolts of the disease. It sounds like you've had that, but I can give you my experience and my perspective. So 20 years ago, or nearly 20 years ago, 2002 CWD was discovered about 65 miles to the south of us. And it was discovered in wild deer.
How long ago was that?
2002.
And when were we having our conversation about, as a country, about, mad cow disease, the human variant of the Jakob? I always get it wrong. Creutzfeldt-Jakobsen
Yeah,
disease.
Creutzfeldt-Jakobs disease.
It's a tough. That's a tongue. But I mean, it's around that time that we are aware of prion diseases.
Right.
In the human population via the bovine version, but
Yep.
this is also simultaneously happening in deer, but it's not making national headlines yet.
They were aware of it in the 60s and 70s out west.
Okay. I didn't know that.
Creutzfeldt-Jakobs might be a tongue twister, but transferable spongiform encephalopathy is another one, right?
I like that one
a
too.
TSC, and that's what Creutzfeldt-Jakobs is. That's what the Creutzfeldt-Jakobs variant of mad cow disease is. That's what scabies in sheep is, and chronic wasting disease in deer.
And that one that they get from cannibalism out in Indonesia. What do they call that one?
Yeah.
There's another one there.
Well, it's the Kuru people, but it's Creutzfeldt. I mean, it's the same. Yeah, but they're eating. So that's so interesting, man. You can talk to Brian Richards for a day about that.
Yeah.
Just how that worked. I mean, it was fairly simple. It was sort of like with cattle. Once they quit feeding cattle to cattle, it pretty much stopped, right? Because that was what was happening. The offal, they call it, the guts and all the extra stuff was being rendered into protein, put in lick tanks and stuff in cattle or in feed, and cattle were eating their cousins.
Yeah.
Well, that's what was happening in with the Kuru people too. And I might have that wrong, but you're referencing the island, that part of their ritual was to sort of eat their dead. It's really interesting when you start thinking about that. But anyway, so in 2002, when it happened, when it was discovered in Wisconsin, there was a little bit of a freak out, and the attempt to control the attempt was not to control the disease. The attempt was to eradicate the disease,
mm-hmm.
because there had been some success doing that in New York State. And the way you do that is you take a big cut and you take a lot. And
it had cropped up in New York State as well.
Yes, it had.
And they had eliminated a big population of deer there.
They actually, a lot of deer in a small area, and it controlled it. So it was like, they refer to those now as sparks, right?
Mm-hmm.
And that spark was, you look into that. And I don't want to speculate too much about exactly what happened there, but it was fairly easy to pinpoint where it started, and fairly easy to pinpoint the area around that point where it started. And they were able to control the disease. And to my understanding at this point, chronic wasting disease continues to be under control in New York State, or hasn't reappeared. They do have it all around Pennsylvania and all of that. One of the common factors is high population. And that's a spreading thing. Well, Southwest Wisconsin, where I am in my county, I happen to be on the County Deer Advisory Council. And so we help with some policy on deer management. We have 60 to 70 deer per square mile of habitat.
Wow.
We have more deer in this county than we have people.
Really?
Yes.
What do you get when you buy a hunting license? How many tags for deer do you get?
Well, you get a buck tag, and last year we gave 4 antlerless tags, but I buy a conservation patron's license, which is both an archery and, I mean, you get all kinds of tags with it, your fishing license and everything, but archery tag and gun tag. So you get a buck tag for each one of those, and then 4 doe tags. So you get 8. The other night, here's some breaking news. The other night on our CDAC meeting, I made a motion, got a second, and we approved handing out 12 antlerless tags with every license.
Wow.
We were trying to get some attention to some of our population problems here. Yeah. I'm sure that we will end up at a lower number in our second, but the people will be showing up to that next meeting.
Right.
Because we lack other tools to control the population. So again, remember what I said about 95% of the land is privately owned. Mm-hmm. But the people's game is on private land. So access, I mean, all of these things are all these factors that are a part of it. So when the Department of Natural Resources first started to try to eradicate the disease in that area 65 miles south of us, it seemed like it was a lifetime away. And they were shooting semi-loads of deer. semi-loads of hay.
Wow.
And taking them to an incinerator, and they weren't even testing them all. So there was an awful lot of venison that was wasted, and that stuck in the craw of some people, as you imagine it was. I mean, the cure or the attempt of what they were trying to do, the policy made sense. The implementation of that policy people started to question that, right? And so there was an upheaval, and we abandoned the attempts after a few years of both eradicating and then eventually controlling. So, and it's a cautionary tale. So when it first happened, we could gun hunt. I mean, I was out with a rifle hunting in October. Now our traditional gun season is the third week of November. It's a 9-day season. We're back to that now. And in fact, law was changed. So the DNR does not have the power to open a gun season before that. So, you know what I mean? The political reaction to it became very, very difficult, became very hard. We had the misfortune of really being the first place in the Midwest to have, CWD. And I think that DNR had the right plan. I mean, I don't think there's any question about what they were trying to do. It made sense. Maybe the implementation of it could have been better or different. And they were trying to, decide on the parameters of the disease. You can go on the DNR website, Wisconsin DNR, or you actually can go on my, what do they call those things? Website. You can go on my website, and I have a page that's CWD, and on there is a short graphic video that will show you the spread of the disease over the last 19 years. We haven't put 2020 on there yet because we don't have all of the data yet. So, and you could see where as we quit trying to manage the disease and these new restrictions on hunting went on, that all of a sudden the disease prevalence and spread just took off. So that we were controlling it with a thing called earn a buck, where you had to shoot a doe before you could shoot a buck, which I had no objection to because we were shooting a lot of does on our place anyway.
And the idea was just to knock the population down.
Yeah. Well, I mean, bucks don't have fawns, right?
Yeah, exactly.
And, okay, kids.
I don't know. Is that okay to say anymore?
Well, but yeah, I mean, our fecundity in this area is like 1.5, 1.6 fawns per doe. Okay. So they are replacing themselves and a half every year.
Yeah, which means growth.
And if you're not shooting a doe, think about how many, the exponential growth is unbelievable. Mm-hmm. And with earn a buck,
and with all that farmland, you have no limitations probably on population growth from a food perspective.
Well, right. The term carrying capacity, what's the capacity? Well, it's worth saying that we can look in the woods and talk about carrying capacity. Yeah. I mean, if all we're trying to do is grow deer, well, that's a different discussion. But if we're trying to actually be conservationists, and hunting is a part of conservation, not the other way around, you can look at the understory in our area in Southwest Wisconsin, and you can see overbrowse. You can see the native species, especially in the regeneration of oaks, that just they're getting hammered. Part of our consideration on this County Deer Advisory Council is the input from the forestry department. And, our county foresters, our DNR county foresters are all over the county, and they're coming in, and then so they have anecdotal experience and anecdotal evidence, but then they also have data because they actually take, there's a whole metrics that they're using within the state to talk about what's the future going to be like for red and white oak in our area, and if anyone who knows about whitetail deer, at least in our area, and I think it's pretty much across their whole range, they love to browse on red oak seedlings, and they love to eat white oak acorns. Mm-hmm. So if you have a overabundance of deer, you're going to have little problems with oak. Yeah. Right. I'm in the middle of a oak regeneration on our farm, and we're being successful, but it's because we're shooting a lot of deer. I mean, we're averaging, 100. Over the last 4 years, we've shot 100 and almost 130 deer on our place.
Wow!
And Yeah. And that's, I mean, you start to think about that.
What percentage of those animals have tested positive for CWD?
Well, I'm happy to report that we're running at about 4%, 5%.
Wow.
Yeah. Well, we're on the northern edge. So when you talk about 2002, there wasn't, they were doing what they call surveillance testing up here.
Yeah.
So they were looking for older deer and that sort of thing. Eventually, because of volunteer testing, we can get every deer tested on our farm. And it was 6 or 7 years ago that we could do that. So since then, we have gotten every deer tested on our farm. Does, bucks, fawns, because we'll take anything.
Yep.
We'll shoot anything. We don't, I mean, people are selective, but at the same time, used to be, and folks go back and just in my time on Meat Eater, right? We talk about how there was this thing whole about wearing a sombrero and letting the younger bucks go.
Remember Joe wearing the sombrero.
Yeah. And so, we don't do that anymore. And part of it is,
can you expand on that again, just for people who maybe haven't seen it, that what I'm hearing from you is, how you hunt has changed, the focus being on growing up big mature bucks and now having to change strategy because of CWD is what you're saying?
Was one of the factors. Yeah. And the biggest factor, don't get me wrong. Yes. And that's an important point. Thank you for asking that. About 5 years ago, CWD was getting closer and closer to us. Now, we've always been, for the last 15 years especially, really been practicing, last 20 years, practicing population control, because what we saw was when we keep the population lower, we see bigger bucks and we see more bucks. And, the National Deer Association folks who used to be QDMA, they can talk to you all about like closer to a 1-to-1 balance and all of these things. Well, to me, it only made sense, right? You're seeing damage in agricultural fields. If you're losing the first 20 yards or 20 feet of your field to deer damage, maybe you have too many deer. If you're seeing a lot of heavy browse, maybe you have too many deer, to achieve that balance. So we saw it as that. And one of the things that was an immediate benefit was all of a sudden we were getting bigger, older, more mature bucks. When I first started hunting, if you saw a buck, you shot it. I mean, that was it's
kind of how it is up here in Maine. Yeah.
Yeah. And this is worth saying. When I was a kid, when I started hunting, until about the time I was 16, so early 70s to mid 70s, in August, you would buy your deer license and 4 people would have to put in to get 1 doe tag. So you'd fill this thing out, send some money in, and you would get, now it's exactly the opposite, right? Yeah. We're giving 4 doe tags with every buck license. And so in my lifetime, we've seen that change in population. And it was because of good management. If good management is growing more deer. So then it's not like you can turn the faucet on or pull the plug out and just change the deer population like that. There's more of an arc to it, right? You have to do it over time.
There's like inertia probably.
Yeah.
Population.
Well, and I know guys my age and certainly ones older, you don't shoot does because of the population thing and, and where the girls are, the boys will be and all that kind of stuff. And, just haven't found that to be true.
Yeah.
So that was a big change. And then of course, hunting media, guilty, been a part of it. Right. Yeah. People don't generally like to watch shows where little tiny bucks are being shot. They want to see big giant bucks. I take great pride in the fact that we've never shot a big giant buck on the Duren farm on Meat Eater, right? Our focus has been on meat and the
Can you describe for people listening who aren't real familiar with hunting media, there's a little bit of trickery going on in some of that, right? A lot of what we're seeing, those big giant bucks, are a lot of times nearly farm raised bucks. A lot of high fence operations to produce some of those deer that we see on TV.
Well, you're going to have to talk to somebody who's been involved with that sort of thing. Right, yeah. I personally haven't. I hear the same things that you do. I will tell you this about Meat Eater. Nothing. I've done 7 episodes and have been on, I don't know, 8 or 10 podcasts, and I've hunted and fished with Steve and his brothers, and there isn't a fake bone in that man's
tell.
body.
Yeah, you can tell.
I mean, it's a story.
Real.
Don't get me wrong. He gets excited about big giant bucks and stuff too. But that's not, that's not the reason. Nothing staged. Nothing is, oh, let's shoot that again. I mean, if they didn't get it, they didn't get it. Yeah. And, the cameramen know that, or camera people know that. And, it's just a remarkable thing that way. And yeah, I know I've heard stories and some firsthand accounts about how like bow shots are recreated and the deer and, and all of that kind of stuff. But I think some of that is that greediness to, well, you got to kill a big giant buck or you're not. My first episode with Steve, I remember him calling me from the Southwest, and this was the first year of Meat Eater, and they were going to have 10 episodes. And he calls me and he goes, man, we got 10 episodes, but 4 of them are skunkers. And I don't think we can have 4. Can we come to your place and hunt rabbits or squirrels or something or pigeons? You know how we always shoot pigeons? Yeah. And he did. And I said, oh, by the way, in those days we could, I mean, that's been, I don't know, 8 or 9 years ago now. I could get landowner tags. And so this is February, and we were out deer hunting with landowner tags.
Yeah.
And I shot a little buck. Carl Malcolm was with us. And Carl said the greatest thing during that. He goes, this is so cool. So we're all standing around the thing and celebrating the deer and talking about it and everything. He goes, what's so cool about this to me is that here we are. I mean, yeah, Doug, I know you shot the deer, but it's like, that's our deer, right? We all got that deer. And when we tell that story later, that's what it's going to be.
Our deer,
So that's why Carl and I are buds, I mean, he just has a like mind. Yeah. Very cool. Brilliant.
Genius. Yeah. Very intelligent.
Yeah. Yeah. So, rabbit holes.
Well, actually it spurs a question for me though, that I never really have gotten to ask anybody. You're kind of the person for me to ask. Something that I've struggled with as somebody who came into hunting pretty late in life and, man, loves the animals that I eat. I truly, I'm in it for the relationship with these creatures. I always liken it to like, imagine you move to a new town, you didn't know anybody, how lonely you feel versus being at home where everybody on the street's like an old friend. You went to high school, their cousins or whatever. It's like, I feel like human beings are like that on the planet. They're like people who've moved to a new town. They don't know any of the species around them, plants, fungi, animals. And humans have become very lonely. We just have like each other and dogs and cats. It's kind of a sad scenario. And when, it's hard to appreciate what you don't know and understand. And I think you look out at the world and you can see that. So I really care about the animals. And I have this challenge with how this one aspect of conservation that's confused me. And I'm just curious your input on it. When I look at how people talk about deer management, I don't see that it's emulating nature a lot of the time. So when I look at how nature does it, predators are going after the young, especially the very young. They're going after the precocious who make mistakes, and they're going after pregnant females who are hindered in their movement, particularly in deep snows and things like that. And then they go after animals in decline. This seems to me almost the 180-degree opposite of our management, which is we go after animals in their most perfect state, their prime. So it's more like that movie, The Predator, right? Where the predator comes down and he wants Arnold Schwarzenegger, the prime human. It's like, that's not really how predators hunt. It's too risky and it's too difficult. So I'm curious your thoughts on that, because it seems to me that a lot of times we have a desire, and that's why I called it greed before. I was curious if that plays a part in it. I don't mean it greed necessarily even bad, but just this desire to gratify ourselves with the presentation of, look what I've been able to do, which is very understandable. It's how we approach a lot of things, but why do we approach deer management in such a different way than how wolves, let's say, would approach deer management? Because they're really good at it, right?
They sure are. But they don't have high-powered rifles.
They do not.
or archery equipment, or a lot of time. And you know what? Hey, if I didn't get one, I'll stop at you can stop somewhere and get a bite to eat or make something when you get home. So their life isn't dependent on it. Interestingly, that's another big change in my lifetime. When I was a kid, deer would get hit on the highway. the highway goes through our farm now. A deer would get hit on the highway, and people, because we didn't have cell phones or anything, people would come up, hey, can I call the sheriff? I hit a deer, and the sheriff would have to come and fill out an accident report. And then there'd be a discussion about who was going to take that deer.
Mm-hmm.
Like if the person didn't want it,
yeah,
the deputy would, they'd say, hey, can you go up and call? Here's a list of people who are interested.
Yeah.
And I'm like, yeah, I'll take it.
I'm on that list.
Yeah. I mean, I'm like the first guy who will take it. Right. I mean, and it's pretty interesting when you think about that. And now they just like litter the roadside.
Wow.
Because of that. So taking one in its prime, yeah, there's the challenge of that, right? I mean, I think a 5-year-old buck or a 4-year-old buck, it's around here is going to be 160 to 200 plus inches of horn, 4 and 5. I mean, we grow big deer really fast here. They don't have to get to be 8 years old like they do in other parts of the country, because we have a lot of mineral in the water, and because we have all kinds of feed for them, and and all of that. That seems a little greedy, but when you listen to like my friends at the National Deer Association, especially more and more, they talk about trying to mimic nature a little bit, in that you would have a more balanced herd. Mm-hmm. So you should take some of the older deer. Of course, I mean, one of the rules of thumb on our place for any of my hunters is if you see an injured deer, you shoot it.
Yeah.
We're just not, and then younger deer, well, there's nothing quite as tender as a 8-month-old. Yeah, right. So I do think that's all a part of it. When I was a kid, if you saw a deer with a horn on it and an antler on it, you shot it. I mean, it's just the way it was. And so some of that mentality changed, and that antler mentality sort of happened. And of course that had to do with, and everything from articles and whatnot, but then outdoor media became, is a part of that. So I also think that, and, it's sort of a blessing and a curse, right? Outdoor media has given me the opportunity to talk about these other things. But I do think that there's I think you're right. I think there's a certain greed. And I also think there's it also takes a certain amount of time to make that shift in thinking.
Yeah. Yep.
I didn't find it to be that difficult. You asked me this question earlier about, well, you changed your buck management. Yeah, I did it on a dime. Because the number one thing was, to me, is, well, what's best for the resource? Mm-hmm. And, my father I remember my first hunting lesson was when my father would come back. He used to go up. We had so few deer here. They'd go up north, where now they have few deer, and would deer hunt up there. And when he'd come back and tell his deer hunting stories, he'd talk about hunting for the other guy. Mm-hmm. Because they did deer drives and they worked all this stuff together. And then when they butchered their deer, they all took the same, amount. They spread it out. And that shifted. It's like my deer. I mean, I know people talk about my deer, and I was one of those guys. I feel like sometimes when I start talking about buck management and that sort of thing, that I want to raise my hand and say, hey, my name is Doug, and I used to be into big buck management too. Like at some sort of at a meeting, and and
at the DA meeting.
Well, but so I'm trying to be. I try to think about my father and that attitude, and these guys that he hunted with, and that whole idea of sharing. And then it's like, well, what's the best thing for the resource? Mm-hmm. And I can tell you this about chronic wasting disease. You see a deer, if you care about animal rights or the effect on a deer.
Sure.
It's a horrific disease.
Can you describe?
I've seen. Well, it's the chronic wasting disease. It is a wasting disease. They literally waste away. Mm. And what's happening is this effect on their brain. So all their faculties and everything are changing. And they literally waste away. And it's, the hard thing about CWD is that you can have a CWD positive deer that looks perfectly healthy, because it takes 2 years, 18 months to 2 years, for that deer to become clinical. And it's really the last 6 to 8 weeks. But I have witnessed deer standing by the side of the road, their head down, standing by water, their head down, and they're just skin and bones. One of the members of our County Deer Advisory Council has dispatched 3 sick deer in their backyard. It's a horrific disease. So if you care about animal welfare, you should be concerned about chronic wasting disease. And I've had chats with, animal rights advocates about it, and they're like, yeah, we're concerned about it. Can we all come together in a circle here?
Sometimes, though, the challenge is like there's a, sorry if I'm interrupting your thought here, but I just want to say that there's this thing where people have when you've grown up on a farm or you're around hunting, it's very easy to think about the species and not get too hung up on the individual. But it seems like a lot of times in the animal rights or animal welfare world, they get very hung up on the individual at the expense of the species. I mean, we're actually seeing this. That scales out. We see this in all our politics too. It's like you got the group who's always thinking about the individual and the group who's always thinking about the big picture. And sometimes what's good for the herd might look bad for the individual. And so you're going to have people who are like, like that idea you talked about. It sounds, if I understood you correctly, New York did that eradication and it worked. But when they tried it out there was pushback because of individual people being worried about the individual deer, not thinking about the herd.
That's a good way of putting it. That, and I think that people quickly discovered that it was a very different situation that was in New York, in that it was a smaller area. Okay. They were able to isolate it. Here it was more difficult because it had already spread out quite a ways when they started doing their surveillance. They're finding that in the state of Tennessee. I've done a couple of things with the state of Tennessee, been on a podcast down there, and then a couple of things with their Parks and Recreation Department, or whatever their typical their name is for their DNR. And they only discovered CWD like 3-4 years ago, and they've already got prevalence of 20%. And it's like, well, wow. And 90 to 100 deer per square mile. It's like, well, it's been there for more than 4 years. Yeah. And that's the other thing that we discovered in Wisconsin. It obviously had been here for a while, so it had it already had time to spread. And by doing surveillance, that's one of the things that we that's what they discovered. So what do you do now is one of the bigger questions. And I know this about CWD. I think in bumper stickers, apparently, it's not ours. It's just our turn. If you don't have CWD in your area, you don't want it.
Yeah.
So act accordingly. And when your state game agency is saying things like, not only are they saying it's illegal to move carcasses from Wisconsin anywhere. I mean, most states are like, So you can take deboned meat, but you cannot take any of the bones or the spinal column or the head or any of that kind of stuff. So if you don't have it, you don't want it. So do that. Do as much as you control. You follow those protocols. And if you do have it, like we do, you want as little as possible. And that becomes a little more difficult, right? So prevalence, spread is one thing, how widely spread geographically the disease is, but prevalence, how many deer in a particular area have it. So we want to reduce prevalence wherever we can, or control prevalence wherever we can. South of us, 60% of the bucks have CWD. Sure, I just was looking at some big giant bucks, and the guy's like, "Yeah, these all had CWD." There's these big giant rats.
All the rats you saw, yeah.
Yeah, and he's like, "These are big giant." These came from that area. Well, so those are 5-year-old deer, and it's like, well, so I mean, you're still getting 5-year-old bucks, and if all you're into is antlers, or if you're cool with eating meat from a CWD positive deer, which is your prerogative if you want to, then, well, maybe it's not that big of a deal to you. The problem with that is, over time, what ends up happening is you don't have big giant bucks anymore because the deer just aren't getting older. There was a lot of talk about how it was going to have population level impacts in our area. And, that's one of the things the folks who aren't concerned about it will say, well, we still have plenty of deer. We still have big populations of deer. Yes, we do. More and more of those deer, we haven't had that crash that they had talked about, but more and more of those deer are positive, and because there's more deer, it's spreading faster.
Yeah.
So that's an interesting thing. And one of the things that I always ask people when they say, well, I'm not afraid to eat it. I'm like, okay, then, but you did get it tested, because if you want to make a personal decision to eat CWD positive meat or meat from a CWD positive deer, that's your personal decision. And right on. That's your choice. Don't make that choice for anybody else.
Man, giving away venison is one of the great joys of my life. And
Yeah.
sharing with people, I really, really love to do that. Now, there's those times where, let's say I've been cod fishing or, get ground fishing. I'll be like, I know there's little worms and nematodes in that meat sometimes. I just don't say anything about it. I'll pick out
Right.
what I see, but I'm not going to sit down at dinner and tell people. Or when I cook black bear for people, I just cook it through. I don't give a big
Yeah.
trichinosis warning, right?
Sure.
But I could never in good faith give venison that I knew was, CWD positive to anyone. But I do want to get your feedback on that, because I notice you must be seeing this, because it sounds like you're interacting with several generations of hunters. And, it's interesting with the millennial generation. I find them to be, I'm an Xer, so I find the millennial generation to be collectivist in their thinking a lot of times. Like you see how they're the enforcers on masks more than anybody, I've noticed. Like the older generation, who's the at-risk population, they're like, this is stupid, I don't care about this. And Xers are like mostly kind of like this individualist survivalist types. We're not like that worried about it. But man, the millennials, who are at the lowest risk, are like, we all are on board. And so when it comes to, I see that kind of a thing typically with them anyway. With this, I would imagine what I notice, but again, I'm in Maine and I'm not really around CWD much, and the conversation's not here. But I would imagine that you've got an older contingent who is like, yeah, this is just a conspiracy theory. The anti is trying to keep us from hunting. And then you get
talking about my people there.
right? And then I imagine the younger generations on board for following all the protocols. Are you seeing that kind of a thing? Is there any trends like that? Because my state's putting out we are really trying to be careful about letting it get here, but it takes everybody being on board,
Yeah. Oh, I think that's a true statement. It's just sort of like the population control thing and shooting does. It's a harder sell to the older generation like mine. I'm a boomer. So, okay, boomer. And
making the world go around.
Yeah, man. But the folks are, because they grew up like I did, where it was rare, but it's like, well, it used to go like, Dylan said, it used to go like that. Now it goes like this. And,
yeah.
The only thing that's constant is change, as far as I'm concerned. And I didn't see any of this to be that difficult, but I would agree with you. Like last Sunday, I had 15 people come out, and some millennials and some Gen Xers, because of that sort of that sweet spot in there of people who are, getting into it, and adult onset hunters and stuff. One of my favorite people is a fellow who just bought some land near here, and he's 45 years old, and he's like, I don't have any of those preconceived notions.
Right.
So like, what's happening?
Right.
He's a guy getting into hunting. So
clean slate.
So what's the best thing? I don't have like, generations of people telling me how to do this stuff. And so he's like trying to flatten his learning curve by hanging out with guys like me and listening to friends like my friends like Mark Kenyon and stuff about deer hunting and other kind of hunting. He's become a really good turkey hunter. But those folks in that group, they're interested in what they're going to get out of it in terms of protein.
Yep.
That's their number one concern. It's way easier to get a kid to shoot a doe than it is, especially someone who's coming from, who isn't like a local kid. But even I was telling you about a friend who had, asked if his kids could come out and hunt, and I put him in some towers and stuff. And well, he's got land. They were shooting does on his place. They came over and shot him on mine. And he's only 4 or 5 miles away. So, but you know what I mean? It's sort of that sort of attitude about it. So the chronic wasting disease situation is a little bit like that as well. I remember one old timer, and old timer, way older than me, said to me, "Oh, the good Lord will take care of this problem." And he wasn't particularly a religious guy, but his point was that this is nature's way of like cutting this herd down. I was like, yeah, but Donnie, heck, we could just shoot more deer and kind of not let nature just wreak havoc, right? I mean, and again, that kind of goes back to this idea of where I'm at, highly manipulated land. It's a highly manipulated landscape.
That's it.
And so consequently, when it is that mankind or humankind has manipulated the landscape so much, the obligation of management is also there.
That's it. And something I've heard Steve say so many times is there's more whitetails now than when Columbus arrived in the New World. So we've created this tremendous boom in their population. This isn't natural. These aren't natural deer herds. I think a lot of people imagine there'd be more deer if it wasn't for people. And it's like, oh, no. There would be less deer. Yeah, deer and turkey seem to just be so symbiotic with people that our habitat, the edges of our habitat, are prime habitat for them. And so it does seem like we have some obligation here to be good
That's
managers.
A really interesting thing to think about, right? Because we talk about fractionalization of the land, parcelization of land. So land getting cut up, farms like ours typically start to get cut up into 80s and 40s. And then that fractionalizes the landscape and the habitat and all of that. There are animals, white-tailed deer are one of them, that thrive in that kind of situation. Coyotes are another. I mean, man, coyotes have just
thrive no matter what we do.
It's like whatever,
more the merrier.
And rabbits and squirrels, seem to be able to get along with all that relationship. Whereas, mule deer, mule deer don't
Caribou,
like it so much.
Not so much here in Maine. We lost them.
And so those sort of things are interesting to think about too. And it should be. I think when you start thinking about conservation, that's kind of the place where you have to have your thought process, your head, to be able to change with whatever happens to be going on, and understand that it's not, nothing's going to change really, really quickly unless it's something like COVID. But in a longer sense, this stuff, these are arcs. When you get something I talk with people about forestry a lot, and it's like, well, it's forestry. There aren't a lot of emergencies, but there are when it comes to something like oak wilt. We get, and so we stop cutting trees here very soon, or trimming them so we're not spreading oak wilt. Making the conditions right for it. So, or if you get the emerald ash borer, which I know has probably ripped through your country out there already, it's here now. And I mean, I was just out in some woods yesterday, and there's just lots and lots of dead ash trees. I remember as a kid when that happened to the elms. So there are those kinds of emergencies. Yeah. And then this is a bit of an emergency too. Well, it's going to be a long time before. Yeah, well, it's only been 20 years. And I'll tell you what, ladies and gentlemen, 20 years goes by very quickly. And
the last 20 have gone by pretty fast for me, Doug.
Well, wait until you get older, man.
I don't
it's
even
just
want to talk about it.
Yeah, right. It doesn't fly, it zooms, but and when you look at that's what's, I think, again, I would refer back to that thing about that DNR piece where it shows how it's spread. Yeah. So the spread of the disease, 20 years ago or 18 years ago, 19 years ago when this first happened, there was kind of a freak out. Well, was this something we got to be, we have to be wearing like rubber suits when we go deer hunting and all that? No, you don't. So you start talking about, well, what about it? So what are you going to do about it, Duren? And what are you going to do about it, hunters? Well, I'd like to think that it's like any problem that we have. I do a lot of work in horticulture also, and we have this little phrase that we use that's called integrated pest management. And so first of all, you try to control whatever the problem is, and you realize that you probably won't eradicate it, like dandelions in a lawn, unless you're willing, and then the question becomes, is the cure worse than the disease?
Right.
And that's, that's an interesting discussion to have about chronic wasting disease. Because if unless it's hitting you kind of in the face, it's hard to think about that. Man, the deer look perfectly healthy. Yeah, you want to look at one that doesn't look perfectly healthy because that's what that one's life is going to be.
Yeah,
if it wasn't shot. I've been challenged a bunch about, because I don't keep meat from a deer that.
I was going to say I'd be remiss not to ask you if you personally eat it, or what your position is on that.
And my position is not to. And part of the reason for that is why would I personally
take
take
the
that
risk?
chance?
You're like, I got
Part of it
grass-fed
is,
beef right here, man.
well, yeah, I mean,
And only 4% of my deer.
well, right. And so to a certain extent, it's like, well, I mean, we're harvesting that many deer a year. And my wife and I really, between what we raise in the garden and the beef and the turkeys and the venison, we really only eat one deer a year. It's her and I,
Wow, yeah.
when you combine all this stuff. And so why would I do that? And the other part of it is I want to be able to share that meat with other people.
Yep.
And I don't want to have a CWD section in my freezer and a non-CWD section.
Run that
we don't
risk.
even butcher them until we find out whether they're positive.
Well, I mean, it's amazing how the ability of these prions to hang on to stainless steel and on cutting surfaces. And I mean, I don't need to explain it to you. I mean, it's shocking what some of the stuff. I mean, I had a biologist recently telling me that plants can uptake it from the soil, and then they could be potentially eaten by the animal, and then they could be infected. But if you were, obviously this is pure speculation, but you shake the magic 8-ball and like, do you think you get a deer to human transmission at some point? I mean, well, actually, let me back up from that and ask you, how much meat is contaminated meat's being eaten? I imagine a lot of people never test, so they don't know. And then some people test and go, I don't care. Do you know personally, have you met a lot of people who are eating CWD positive meat on purpose?
On purpose. I don't know people who are, I know people who've said they would.
Right.
But I don't know. Yeah, I will. Okay. So when that happens, will you do me a favor and be sure, because actually our DNR asks you this question when you register or when you find out whether it's positive or not, because they send you a little email or they send you a card or whatever. Do you still plan on eating it? So check your name. Yes, I do. Wow. I will. Right. So, because again, it's a prion-based disease, and man, you've talked to scientists. I'm a farm guy who knows a lot about animal husbandry and respect for nature and respect for animals and all that. The scientists can tell you more about this, but the longer you live, the more apt you are to get it there. And as we know, there has been no case where a variant of Creutzfeldt-Jakob's disease has been traced to eating CWD positive meat. And yet.
Yeah.
And I mean, but to me, I had a discussion with someone in the outdoor industry about this. I might even go so far as to call it a disagreement. He goes, I don't even bother getting it tested because I'm going to eat it anyway.
Wow.
And I'm like, okay, are you sharing that meat with other people? And that gave him pause.
Mm-hmm.
Because I said, do you have kids? Do you have grandkids? are you sharing that with them?
The way that they would die is so horrible,
Yeah, and I don't want to be responsible for that
for a
thing,
horrible
right? It's sort of
death in a loved one. I mean, a horrible death,
Well, last weekend when we had when we had the Learn to Hunt thing, I required everybody to wear masks when we were in a group. We weren't even inside; we were outside, but we weren't able to maintain. In order to chat, we were going to have to be close. And I was like, "Look, if you're not willing to wear a mask, don't come." Once we got out, and I was like, "Okay," and that's the guy from PF from Pheasants Forever said, "Hey, once you get out, that's cool, but Doug really wants us, and we want you to." Everybody was very respectful of that, right? Well, it's my place, it's my way or the highway, right? Yeah. I didn't want to be responsible for that. Right. It's the same way that I wouldn't want to be responsible for somebody for that happening, especially if it was, someone else. And you want to stop somebody from eating venison who's like you're trying to practice venison diplomacy with. Tell them this is, well, by the way, this is from a CWD positive deer.
It might have CWD.
Yeah. Or in my case, I know.
I tested it. Yeah.
Right, we had it tested. So I really don't know personally anybody who said, yeah, I'm going to eat it. I've had a lot of people call me and say, hey, is it all right if I bring, I cut this deer up, it's tested positive because we went ahead and cut it up. Is it okay for me to put that in the disposal dumpster, which, I've started that program.
Oh, you did?
And I
Yeah.
said, oh yeah. And I said, absolutely, absolutely. And too bad you spent all that time on it. I
Yeah.
happen to, our old milk house, we turned into a butcher shop and cooler. So we skin them and hang them and wait until we find out, just
Right,
before we
right,
spend
right.
too
Before
much
you
time.
start putting all that work in.
And I know other people who've, like retrofitted refrigerators to let their meat age in there. And in Wisconsin, you find out in 7 to 10 days. So it's not
Okay.
a
That's
long
a nice
period
hang
of
time
time.
anyway. So
Yeah. Right. Oh yeah. No, it totally is. Um, and so, there's been that, but I've also had people say, hey, but please don't mention this to anybody because my buddies will ridicule me
wow.
if they find out that I'm not doing this. But I'll tell you this, Daniel, in the last 3 years where I've done the dumpster program and the adopt a dumpster program and started it because I shot my mouth off on Joe Rogan's podcast. I mean, but it was like, well, if DNR isn't going to do this, I'm going to do it. And I did. And then we started
Okay.
a program that's now being, it's being replicated not only across the state, but in other states. And I take great pride in that.
Where
And
does it
thank
go from the
everybody.
dumpster? Because obviously this meat is, you can't just, I mean, I think people listening get it, but you can't just throw this out on the side of the road or in a hollow somewhere. I mean, it's got to, what do you do? Incinerate it, bury it? What happens to it?
No. It goes to, the best case would be that it would be incinerated, but it's from a cost standpoint. So all of this stuff is risk reduction, right?
Yeah.
So clay lined landfills.
Oh
So
yeah.
what we know about clay is that it binds the prions up, just like I have a soil science background, just like it binds up nutrients in the soil, it'll bind up the prions.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. You got it. And so, so that's where it goes. And there's a number of certified landfills in the licensed landfills in our area that will accept it. And we use a licensed hauler. And what we do is put a heavy duty liner inside of the thing and the carcasses go in, and there's some holes get poked and that happens, but we're reducing that risk tremendously. Still carcasses out there. We found a half a dozen dead deer out on the landscape last weekend.
Okay.
And their carcasses but we had pretty hard snap there during the winter and they were younger deer. When you were talking about that thing about wolves and all that earlier, guess which ones die first?
Yeah.
The young and the, and infirmed. We did find one deadhead buck, the whole carcass there, but speculated that deer had been shot just kind of by where it was, and it had been shot, and then it just wasn't found, wasn't recovered. But so disposing of, things that you can do about CWD is one, hunt, keep hunting, reduce risk to yourself by wearing gloves and plastic sleeves when you're cleaning it. And honestly, once I started doing that, but this kind of goes back to the farm stuff too, because you do stuff with cattle, you wear gloves and sleeves.
Right.
And get into what we're doing. But anyway, so you do that, you clean your tools and and I have stainless steel tables in my little butcher shop, and with a bleach water solution, and it's showing that it's reducing it. I will tell you, here's a tip: don't leave your knives in a bleach water solution for very long.
Gotta be hard on them, huh?
Oh man, it pits them. So you really got to, you clean them and do all that. So you're reducing the risk as much as you can, right? Disposing of that carcass properly by putting it in the dumpster. There's still a lot of carcasses in our dumpsters that people aren't testing them.
Yeah.
But at least they're disposing of them properly. I had one guy say to me, this is really a great program that's going on here. And as he threw a couple carcasses in, and I'm like, you want to cut the head off? And they were does, and you want to test that deer? And he's like, no.
They're just using it as a place to get rid of carcasses.
Well, right. He goes, and this is one guy I went to school with for 12 years. And he said, this was 3 years ago, right? And he goes, well, why would I get it tested? I said, for chronic wasting disease, CWD. He goes, CWD, sounded like Homer Simpson. CWD, is that stuff still around? And I'm like, yeah. He goes, oh, I just thought the whole idea here was just that the carcasses wouldn't end up in the ditch on a side road somewhere.
Oh, that's funny.
Which, of course, he was just telling me where he was getting rid of his before there was a dumpster.
Now I know that was you.
So it's met with great response.
Yeah.
The first year we had 5 locations, and through some fundraising I did with some other folks, we were able to pay for 5 locations, I also have a testing kiosk on my farm. 3 years later, DNR is paying 500 is footing some of the
Oh,
cost
cool.
of it's still unfortunately, well, or fortunately, the program has also increased in popularity. So I had 5 dumpsters. Other people took over the other locations that we do, but I had 5 dumpsters on the 2 locations that I had
Wow.
for a total of almost $4,000. And DNR gave me 1,000. Fundraising was 1,000 from donations, and like one township gave me some money, and a couple of sportsmen's clubs gave me money. But I ended up paying out of pocket about $1,800. I sell merchandise on my website, DougDuren.com, and thankfully some of the revenue for that offsets those costs. We're hoping and working that now this year that the department, the new biennial budget will include enough that costs will be 100%
Offset.
paid for by the DNR, but people like me who still are willing to have it on their property and are willing to manage it will save that cost to the DNR of not having to have somebody else, one of their employees doing it. So it's kind of a good public-private partnership. And so we're reducing, it's like picking up garbage, right? There's still always going to be garbage, but there's less of it when you pick it up. It's like, you blow your nose, you don't throw in the Kleenex on the floor, you throw it in the garbage. And so it's that sort of thing. So all of that, well, you're still going to be around. Yes, it is still going to be around, but there's going to be less of it.
Less. Yep.
So if you have it, you want as little as possible. So let's act accordingly. So that just taking care of carcasses and doing the best we can for hygiene is really important. And then hunting deer and taking deer and getting them tested so we can understand the disease a little bit more. Supporting your Department of Natural Resources, who's willing to try to think a little bit beyond yourself. And one of the other things that I'm really challenging my friends in the landowning community to do is to allow other people access. I'll tell you, man, like 5 years ago, I shot 7 does. And I had no intention of, like I told you, my wife and I used 2, or 1 or maybe 2. And so all of a sudden here, I'm like a deer eradicator, right? And that doesn't feel real good. You were talking about the respect for the animals and stuff like that, man, just like with my cows, when I send them off to be butchered, or my cattle, when I send them off to be butchered, it's not just a thing, right? It's just like, oh, that's what happens. No, I feel that. It's the same way with the deer. So besides a buck, I shot 7 does. I'm like, wait a minute, there's got to be another way of doing this. So I started inviting more people to come and hunt, because I got all those deer tested, and they all went to good use. They went to the venison donation program. The ones that we didn't use, or my brother-in-law who always wants one. Hey, Tom, I've got one. It's at the locker. It's for you. They got it all marked up. But then I donated them, so, it's those sort of things. So sharing the venison is one thing, but I looked at it and went, why couldn't I share this opportunity to hunt with other people who will harvest that deer, who will do all those things, and test it and have that process, have that situation, and then take it home. So it's like a win-win-win.
So many more positives come out of that than you just doing it on your own, right? Plus you reduce your own workload. That's one part. But really, because then all those people get to have those experiences. They get drawn into the world of conservation more. They get meat. Like it's many more parties win.
And that's the conversation that happens around it, as opposed to we're going deer hunting. We are practicing conservation by doing this. And here are all the reasons that we're doing this. And I think those conversations about conservation, which can get a little confusing to say sometimes, are really important. And even if some of those folks that I'm inviting and that we're working with doing these learn to hunt programs, even if they don't continue hunting, I think they're developing a bigger understanding of conservation, and that maybe down the road, when somebody said something about hunting or conservation, they go, hunting, there's a lot of reasons for doing it. It's just not big old giant killing, it's not all what you see or what you think it is, slob hunters and all that. There's reasons, conservation reasons for it. And at the ballot box,
Right.
they're going to vote for conservation.
Right. Yeah.
I think those things are really important.
Very
and I
important.
credit all that to people like Aldo Leopold
Yeah.
and guys like Carl Malcolm. I could listen to Carl all day long talk about this stuff.
Right.
And that's why he and I are like-minded too.
Yeah.
So,
hey man, I want to, in a minute talk about your website and social media and stuff, but I want to ask you kind of in conclusion to all this, I feel like you kind of just laid out like the best case scenario, how we all kind of pitch in and work together from the landowner down to the hunter. What's the like worst case scenario if we, I think even though the world of, let's say, waterfowling is so established as a form of hunting or, Western elk hunting or whatever, but you talk to most people, you say hunting, they think about white-tailed deer, that's sort of what's in people's mind. Where is there like a worst case scenario? How does this impact hunting long-term if we don't do anything? I mean, or do you think we're in a place where it's like, man, there's so many things underway right now that's not going to happen? The departments are involved now. Like, are the wheels already in motion, or is there still chance for this to really go the wrong way?
Oh, we are in Wisconsin. We are still headed the wrong way.
Okay.
So it's not even a chance. We're just doing it. Our biologists and the people who have managed deer for, since Leopold, started the wildlife ecology department at the University of Wisconsin. Those folks did such a great job of managing deer that we had this big population, but suddenly, suddenly they don't know what they're doing. And that's, there's this attitude about our wildlife professionals in some circles that, and unfortunately in Wisconsin, some of those circles happen to be on the Natural Resources Board, who's actually telling the department what they can do. And then and people in our legislature as well, telling the department what they're doing, putting handcuffs on them so that they can't, restricting their mission, I guess, not putting handcuffs on, but restricting their mission. And that's really problematic. And so we're working really hard at change, and there's a lot of good people that are working on it. But understanding is really important. What's the worst case scenario? I'll tell you a worst case scenario is there aren't deer. There are anecdotal situations. There's an area down by the Wisconsin River. The white-tailed deer population is having population level impacts, two kinds, both on the total population and on demographics. The demographic one is really interesting. I just got I solicited CWD stories from people because I'm going to be on a panel coming up that I wanted to talk about the landowner perspective and the hunter's perspective, right? And I know this to be true because I've actually talked to this guy before. He was a part of a lease, and leasing is pretty big in Wisconsin. So he was a part of a lease in that area for 4 years. In those 4 years, he and 5 other guys, every buck that they shot was CWD positive, every buck. And so the other thing that happened was when they first leased, they shot 4 and 5 year old bucks because they were trying to do buck management, and they shot 4 and 5 year old bucks, and those deer tested positive. And then as the years went on, by the end of the 4th year, the oldest deer that they were seeing were 3-year-old bucks, and they were all testing positive. And they were finding, and he's not the only one. There've been a handful of other landowners that I know. They found dead deer on their property, tended to be older deer. Now, after winter, like the ones that we found the other day, most of those were younger deer who I think, just didn't make it very well. So worst case is not only do you have a population level impact where the population crash hasn't happened, in a bigger area like that was the concern 20 years ago, but prevalence is getting so high. What's the tipping point? Mm-hmm. But the other part of it is if you're concerned about hunting big giant bucks, and you want to do that, I'm right. You give me a chance between 160 inch deer and 120 inch deer. I'd like to shoot them both, but I'll take that. I'll take that bigger one. That because it's a 2-year disease. Imagine this: one of my friends had a buck fawn test positive. Well, he was never going to get to be a big giant buck. Wow. He's going to be 2 years old. He's going to die. Yeah. So that's the worst case.
That we lose big giant bucks altogether because they can't reach that age class anymore.
And then you have a population that is mostly diseased. We have prevalence of over 50% in our areas here now. So imagine there's times you can drive out here in the evening and see 75, 80, 100 deer in a field. Half of those deer are carrying a disease that's going to spread to the rest of them.
It's 100% fatal.
It's 100% fatal.
Right.
So that's the worst case.
Yeah.
I do feel, and I try to be an optimistic person, even though I'm a crotchety old man. I do feel that there, well, thanks. But I do feel like there is an attitude change. Like I said, in our County Deer Advisory Council, we're asking for more tools to be able to control more the population. And we're hearing from the public because we're supposed to be the conduit to the Natural Resources Board we rarely hear, well, I'm not seeing enough deer, or don't bring Ernebuck back. I mean, we have more people than not asking for Ernebuck to come back. 5-7 years ago, it's like, get rid of that Ernebuck thing.
Yeah. Okay. That's the shooting the doe before you can shoot a buck.
Yeah. And what we're really talking about is something called bonus buck, where if you shoot a doe, you get another buck tag.
Okay. Give that real incentive.
And then the other thing is if you shoot a doe and it tests positive, you get a replacement tag, but you don't really need one because you already got 4 tags, right? Right. So how about when we do that replacement tag could be a buck tag. Yeah. And so that's going to encourage more does being shot and more testing. And then the third thing that we're also asking for is that we can, allow more gun hunting in there. We have some antlerless only seasons, but we'd also like to allow buck hunting. I mean, more gun hunting and buck hunting in those seasons. Yeah. The point is it gets more people out.
Yeah. Wow. It's really inspiring to me how involved you've become in all of this. I mean, it's really cool, man. I mean, thank you for your service.
Well, you're welcome. I mean, and there's a lot of room. I mean, this is one of the cool things about it, Daniel, is that I get contacted from people who say, how can I help? Mm-hmm. And then I'll say, well, in your area, I mean, if it was Wisconsin, for instance, in your area, get involved with your County Deer Advisory Council. Bring these concerns up. Think about adopting a kiosk or helping out with the Adopt a Dumpster program. Be supportive of your agencies. Talk to other hunters and fill your tags. Yeah. We are not gonna run out of deer.
Yeah. Right on. Tell people about your website. You said you had some merch there that helps to support all this.
Yeah. Well, it's interestingly enough, www.dougduren.com. That's Duren is my last name. And on there are a couple of there's a CWD page there. And what I've done is there's a couple of articles I wrote for Meat Eater there. There's this little slideshow that I was telling you about from Wisconsin DNR. But then there's connections to like the National Deer Association, to the Wildlife Health Center, USGS.
Okay, so we can follow
there's
up
other
on
places
all this stuff there.
Yeah, you can follow up on that, and it'll lead you down rabbit holes, and you can spend the next month reading about all this stuff if you want. But it's interesting, and I'm going to try to keep that updated. And there is some merch on there as well. We're and that supports my endeavors. And a cool thing about the merch has been that it's spreading both it's supporting these things, but it's also spreading that message of it's not ours, it's just our
Is that what's on the merch?
Yeah.
Oh,
yeah,
cool. I'll go over there and grab something today. I like that.
But I also did, we also did a tree planting thing. Cause like I told you, I was an old hippie tree planter back in the day. And, I did the U.S. Forest Service, or the Forest Foundation, was doing a fundraiser to plant trees in national forests, especially in the areas that had burned. And we there's some merchandise on there. Like I said, I think in bumper stickers, and it says "Plant trees, grow memories." If you've ever planted a tree and then you've lived for another 50, 60 years, I'm 62. There's nothing quite like seeing a tree that you planted when you were a kid.
I was wondering about that when you said it earlier, that you had done that back in the day. And I was wondering if you'd visited any trees or any areas where you'd planted and seen those trees.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. That was mostly in the South. Mm-hmm. But I have those. But then I also, when I came back, I planted trees on our farm too. I mean, there's big giant oaks and well, so awesome. Big giant pines more, but then some oaks too that we've grown. That stuff, that connection, I think is really important. You know, we talk about extraction a lot. Mm-hmm. How about contributing? Landowners, public or private, should be contributing to their land and contributing to conservation. And that's what I'm trying to do. And that's really the message of all of this, right? Is we're all in this together. And if you honor the past, live the present, and plan for the future. Yeah. It's not ours, it's just our turn. So right on, man.
Doug Duren, thank you so much for your time today.
Yeah, happy to be here. Thank you.
Thanks for listening to the WildFed podcast. You can help us grow this show by subscribing and leaving us a rating and review. It ensures better rankings and more advertiser interest, which translates directly into better shows, more awesome guests, and a constant stream of fresh, new content. Have a question you'd like answered on the show, or a hunting, fishing, or foraging trip you'd like to host us on? Email us at info@wild-fed.com. And be sure to visit our website, wild-fed.com, to check out the WildFed video show and store. WildFed. Food is all around you.